The night of the Midsummer Assembly, Henrietta stood at the center of the Harwick ballroom, while 300 people waited to see what she would do next. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like cold water, that she had a choice. She could accept the verdict. She could lower her eyes, fold herself smaller, and let Lady Dorothea's words settle over her like a sentence passed by a court with no avenue of appeal. Or she could speak. The candles burned in their dozens above her, and the musicians had stopped, and every face in the room was turned toward a woman in a borrowed gown who had come to this season with £70 and no house, and no name anyone thought worth protecting. She did not lower her eyes. 7 years before that night, Henrietta Marlowe had been 18 years old and unremarkable, by the season's accounting. Her father, a country clergyman who had educated her beyond his means and far beyond anyone's expectations, had brought her to Bath for a single fortnight that the family could not properly afford. She had worn a white gown that was clean and carefully pressed, and quite plainly the only gown she had. She had carried herself as though this were not apparent. It was apparent to everyone. The assembly rooms that summer were crowded with the usual geometry of the marriage market. Young women arranged like figurines at their mothers' elbows, young men calculating at their leisure, the whole machinery of rank and fortune grinding forward with the patience of something that had been working for centuries and expected to work for centuries more. Henrietta had not minded the machinery, precisely. She had understood it. What she had not expected was the child. He was perhaps 7 years old, the son of a baronet's widow who had brought him along in a moment of poor planning, and he had been knocked sideways by a hurrying footman near the top of the staircase. The child had not cried out. He did not cry out because he was deaf. And the world's noise, including his own voice, had never quite organized itself for him in the usual way. He had simply sat down very hard on the marble floor and looked at his bleeding palm with an expression of patient bewilderment while the assembly swirled past him, and precisely no one stopped. Henrietta stopped. She knelt beside him on the floor of the Bath assembly rooms in her best white gown, and took his hand in both of hers, and pressed her clean handkerchief over the cut, and held it there. And when he looked up at her, she did not speak, because she had noticed almost at once that he watched her lips, and not her eyes. She shaped her words slowly and smiled at him, and kept her hand steady against his until the bleeding stopped, and a frantic housemaid came pushing through the crowd to collect him. The child looked back at her over the housemaid's shoulder as he was carried away, and his expression had shifted from bewilderment into something quieter and more trusting, which was the kind of look that, once given, a decent person did not forget. She did not know, rising from the floor with a small bloodstain on her hem and her hair coming loose from its pins, that the man standing at the edge of the crowd had watched every moment of it. She did not know his name. She knew only that he was tall and still in the particular way of a man who has trained himself to feel nothing in public, and that when their eyes met briefly across the heads of the dispersing crowd, his expression did not move at all, and she looked away first. His name was Edmund Vane, and he was the Duke of Ashford, and he was 24 years old, and in 7 years he did not forget her face. The present season opened in the second week of April, and Henrietta entered it with considerably less than she had possessed at 18. Her father had died in March, a quiet and unhurried death that had nonetheless hollowed the house on the hill in Wiltshire down to its bones. The entail had always existed. She had always known it existed. The estate, such as it was, 400 acres of decent farmland and a serviceable stone house with a leaking east wing, passed in its entirety to a male cousin named Mr. Herbert Marlowe, who had visited precisely twice in Henrietta's memory, and who arrived to claim his inheritance with a solicitor and a measuring look and no ceremony at all. She left with £70 and the contents of her father's library, which she could not carry and which the cousin sold. She carried instead 3 dresses and her father's Bible, and the particular quality of endurance that her life had been quietly manufacturing in her for years. She was 25 years old. The season was her only option, presented to her by her mother's sister, Mrs. Augusta Fenn, as an opportunity rather than a necessity, though they both understood what it was. It was at Mrs. Fenn's assembly in the 3rd week of April that the label was first given to her, in a voice not quite low enough to be private. Lady Dorothea Vane, the Duke of Ashford's aunt, and the most architecturally formidable woman in any room she occupied, was speaking to Lady Cecily Fontaine, the girl's mother, near the east window. Henrietta was not meant to hear. She heard. "The Marlowe girl," Lady Dorothea said, with the considered precision of a woman who chooses her phrasing the way a surgeon chooses instruments. "A charity case, nothing more. One hopes she will not linger." The girl at Lady Dorothea's elbow was Miss Cecily Fontaine, whose dowry of £12,000 was, as Lady Dorothea had occasion to mention to several people that evening, quite the most sensible figure the season had produced. Miss Fontaine was genuinely pretty, and genuinely kind, and genuinely certain that she was the correct choice for the Duke of Ashford, because Lady Dorothea had been telling her so since January, and no one had contradicted it. Henrietta heard the words, and she stood quite still, and she did not permit her expression to change. This was not courage exactly. It was practice. The Duke of Ashford arrived at Mrs. Fenn's assembly 40 minutes after Henrietta, and she did not see him enter, because she was engaged in a conversation with the vicar's wife about her father's funeral sermon, a conversation she was grateful for because it gave her somewhere to stand. She heard the small disruption that always attends the arrival of a man of his rank, the slight recalibration of the room, and she felt, rather than saw, the geometry shift. She kept her eyes on the vicar's wife. She did not know that he had seen her across the room within 4 seconds of entering it. She did not know that he stood at the edge of a conversation with Lord Barrow for 11 minutes without contributing a single word to it, because his attention was engaged elsewhere, and he was experienced enough at concealment to ensure that nothing in his posture gave this away. She knew only that when she finally looked up, he was standing 6 feet away and watching her with an expression she could not read, and that he said good evening in a voice that was level and formal and gave her absolutely nothing. "Miss Marlowe," he said, "I was sorry to hear of your father's death." She was surprised that he knew who she was. She allowed none of this to reach her face. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "He was a good man." "He was," Edmund said, which surprised her further, since she had not known they were acquainted. He offered nothing more. He moved on. She watched him cross the room to where Lady Dorothea and Miss Fontaine were standing, and Lady Dorothea's face arranged itself into satisfaction, and Henrietta turned back to the vicar's wife, and resumed the conversation about the funeral sermon. She did not let herself wonder what he had meant. The offer came 3 weeks later, delivered not at a ball or an assembly, but in the small sitting room of Mrs. Fenn's house at 9 in the morning, with the April light coming through curtains that were always slightly too thin for the room. Edmund arrived without prior appointment, which in itself told her something about the nature of the interview. Mrs. Fenn was sent out of the room by his expression before he said a word. He sat down across from Henrietta and folded his hands together and looked at her with those level eyes and said with perfect courtesy and no warmth whatsoever that he wished to make her a proposal of marriage. He outlined the terms precisely. Ashford Park, a proper settlement, which Mr. Pruitt, his solicitor, would draw up in full and which she would have time to review. A household. Security. He said it as a man recites the terms of a contract he has already decided to sign. He did not say anything that resembled affection. She sat and listened and kept her hands still in her lap. 70 pounds? 3 dresses? The cousin already repainting the Wiltshire house. She knew what this was. She had enough of her father's education to name it clearly. A man of his rank and resources offering rescue to a woman whose circumstances had made rescue the only logical offer. She was grateful for it. She was also, in some quiet and carefully controlled part of herself, quite thoroughly wounded by it. "I understand your meaning, Your Grace," she said when he finished. He looked at her steadily. "Do you accept?" "Yes," she said. "I accept." She thought she saw something shift in his expression, very briefly, like a shadow crossing still water. Then it was gone, and he stood, and they discussed the matter of the settlement in the same register in which he had presented the proposal, and she answered his practical questions with practical answers, and when he left, she sat in the thin April light for a long time and said nothing to anyone. She told herself it did not matter whether it was pity. What mattered was that she would not spend the rest of her life depending on Mrs. Fenn's thin curtains. If you find yourself moved by Henrietta's quiet endurance, it would mean a great deal if you left a comment or subscribed before we reach the night that changes everything. Now stay with the story. The engagement was announced at the Ashford Ball in May, and the label was given to her again. This time in a slightly different room and by a slightly different voice, though the voice was still Lady Dorothea's and the words were still arranged with surgical precision. Henrietta was standing near the refreshment table when she heard the Countess of Barrow ask Lady Dorothea, in tones she apparently considered private, whether the Duke had not been expected to choose elsewhere this season. "Expected, yes," Lady Dorothea said. "But Edmund has always been too disposed to mercy. A charity case, nothing more, whatever the ring on her finger may suggest. We shall see how she wears the title." The Countess murmured something sympathetic. Henrietta took a glass of lemonade from the table and drank it, and returned the glass and went to find her seat for dinner, and she carried herself the way she always carried herself when the world delivered its verdicts, with her shoulders straight and her face composed, and the wound folded very small and very deep where it could not be seen. The ring on her finger was a sapphire that had belonged to Edmund's grandmother. He had placed it there in the formal ceremony of the announcement with his jaw set and his hands perfectly steady, and he had not looked at her with anything she could identify as warmth. She had thanked him. He had nodded once. Mrs. Fenn had cried, which was something. She arrived at Ashford Park the 2nd week of June, 3 weeks before the Midsummer Assembly, as the new Duchess of Ashford by license and settlement, though the settlement had been generous beyond anything she had expected, and Mr. Pruitt had explained it to her with the careful thoroughness of a man who had been told by his employer to be certain she understood every clause. The estate received her in the way that great houses receive new occupants, with the formal indifference of stone and windows, and a housekeeper named Mrs. Cray who was cautiously respectful and waiting to form an opinion. Henrietta formed her opinion of Ashford Park in the first 3 days. It was large and cold in its upper corridors, and warm and genuinely beautiful in its south rooms, and it had a garden that was running somewhat to seed in a way that suggested a household too occupied with its own grief to notice the roses. She noticed the roses. She did not presume to direct anything about them yet. She also noticed, within 48 hours of arriving, the boy. He was 9 years old, slight and fair-haired, with the particular watchfulness of a child who has learned to read the world through its surfaces rather than its sounds. His name was Thomas, and he was Edmund's ward, a nephew of his first wife who had been brought to Ashford Park 4 years ago, when his parents died, and who lived in the East Wing with a tutor who meant well and communicated badly. She had not been told about Thomas's deafness. She noticed it herself, watching the way he tracked movement rather than sound at dinner, watching the way he positioned himself near walls where he could see the whole room. She said nothing about it to Edmund, because she was not certain yet what kind of husband tolerated observation, and she did not wish to give him cause to dismiss her. She spent 2 mornings reading to Thomas. She did this not as a method or a strategy, but because on the 2nd morning she had found him alone in the library with a book he had clearly exhausted, running his finger over the illustrations with the focused patience of a child who has made the best of what is available. She sat down beside him and opened a volume of natural history that had good engravings and began to trace the images with her finger, in the same way he did, naming each one with her lips shaped carefully, watching his eyes come up to her face and understand that she was speaking and not expecting him to hear. Within 20 minutes, he had moved closer. Within an hour, he was leaning against her arm. She did not know that Edmund had come to the library door on the 2nd morning and stopped there. She was reading the description of a migratory bird with her lips moving clearly, her finger following the picture, and Thomas had his hand on top of hers and was watching her face with a kind of concentrated trust that Edmund had not seen on the boy's face since the early months after his arrival, when everything had still been strange and painful, and the trust had not yet been worn away by his tutor's well-intentioned failures. Edmund stood at the library door and watched his wife read to a deaf child who could not hear a word of it, and something that had been locked in his chest for 7 years shifted with the quiet force of ice moving on a river in late winter. He had seen her do this before. Not this precisely, but the essence of it. Kneel beside the person no one was kneeling beside. Offer the thing that was needed without being asked. Keep her hand steady. Bath, 1807. A marble floor and a bleeding child and a woman in a white dress who had not once looked around to see whether anyone was watching. He had not forgotten her. He had carried her face for 7 years in the same drawer of himself where he kept the things that still had the capacity to hurt him, which was also where he kept the memory of his first wife, Caroline, who had died in the 3rd year of their marriage on a road that was worse than the coachman had reported, on a night when Edmund had insisted the carriage return to Ashford rather than stay over, because he had a meeting in the morning, and he had believed the weather was merely inconvenient rather than dangerous. The investigation had found no fault. He had found fault himself, every morning for 4 years, in the particular way of a man who cannot argue himself out of a conclusion his conscience has already reached. He had not allowed himself to want anything since Caroline. He had certainly not allowed himself to want a woman he could not have, which Henrietta Marlowe had been for all 7 of those years, occupied first with her father's decline, and then with the season's unforgiving arithmetic. When her father died, and Mrs. Fenn had written to Lady Dorothea, and Lady Dorothea had brought the letter to Edmund as evidence of the sort of unsuitable entanglement he must now be careful to avoid, he had read the letter twice and gone to Mrs. Fenn's house the following morning with a proposal already composed. He had framed it as mercy because he did not know how else to give her something he owed her without her refusing it out of pride. He understood pride. He had 7 years of evidence that she possessed it in quantity. Standing at the library door, watching her with Thomas, he understood that he had framed it wrong. It was not mercy. It had never been mercy. He withdrew from the doorway before she looked up, which meant she finished the chapter in the natural history book and closed it and showed Thomas the engraving of the migratory bird one more time, and did not know that anyone had been watching. She walked back to the south corridor, believing herself entirely unobserved, believing herself useful and alone, believing that this marriage was an arrangement which the Duke tolerated for reasons of his own conscience, and which she must make the best of without expecting anything more. She had no way of knowing that Edmund spent the remainder of that afternoon at his desk with a letter in front of him that he did not write, because every version of what he needed to say was either too little or too much, and he had a deep mistrust of both. Lady Dorothea arrived at Ashford Park 5 days before the Midsummer Assembly, and with her came Miss Fontaine, ostensibly to visit a mutual acquaintance of the families who lived 2 miles distant, but actually, as Henrietta understood perfectly well within an hour of her arrival, to make a particular point. The point was made by arrangement of the drawing-room. Miss Fontaine was seated at the pianoforte, where she played with genuine accomplishment, while Henrietta sat with her embroidery near the window in a posture that Lady Dorothea's placement of chairs had contrived to render somewhat removed from the room's center. Miss Fontaine played Haydn. Edmund sat near the fire and watched the flames. Henrietta set 4 even stitches in her embroidery and listened to the Haydn, and did not look at Edmund, and Edmund did not look at her, and Lady Dorothea watched them both with the composed satisfaction of a woman whose arrangements were proceeding as planned. The Midsummer Assembly was held at the Harwick Rooms, which were the largest assembly rooms in the county, and which Lady Dorothea had been patronizing for 23 years, a fact she managed to convey within the first 5 minutes of any Harwick gathering, without having to state it directly. The rooms were warm and overlit with candles, and full of exactly the people whose opinions constituted, in Lady Dorothea's accounting, the social facts of the world. 300 of them, by Henrietta's quiet estimate. She knew how many candles, too. 40 in the central chandelier, and 8 on each of the side brackets. She had counted them because counting things was what she did when she was managing herself carefully. She had worn the green silk that was the best of her 3 dresses, which was not as fine as Miss Fontaine's ivory gown, or as authoritative as Lady Dorothea's grey moiré, but which fit her well, and carried what she had to carry. Mrs. Cray had done her hair, with unexpected skill and unexpected gentleness, and she had the sapphire on her finger, and the Duke of Ashford beside her in the formal sense, and the season's judgment assembled around her like a court in session. She knew what Lady Dorothea was planning. She did not know the specific shape of it, but she understood the logic well enough. The engagement ball had produced the label. The drawing-room arrangement had produced a picture. The Midsummer Assembly would produce a conclusion. She had not been wrong about many things this season. The conclusion arrived an hour into the evening, when Lady Dorothea was speaking to a group of 6 matrons near the east window, and her voice was carrying with the precise volume of a woman who has calculated the radius of her audience. Miss Fontaine stood nearby, composed and lovely, and looking at nothing in particular. "One hears she was quite penniless," Lady Dorothea said, with the tone of someone confirming a well-established fact for the benefit of those who might have missed it. "A charity case, nothing more, whatever the settlement says. Edmund's mercy does him credit. His judgment is a separate matter." The 6 matrons received this. Several of them nodded with the careful neutrality of people who have not yet decided which way to stand. Several looked toward Henrietta with the particular brand of sympathy that is mostly curiosity wearing borrowed clothes. The label had now been said 3 times. It had been said to Lady Cecily Fontaine's mother, and it had been said to the Countess of Barrow, and it had been said to the 6 matrons of the county, with the full weight of Lady Dorothea's 23 years of Harwick patronage behind it. 3 settings, 3 audiences, 1 verdict. Henrietta stood at the center of the room and understood that she had a choice. She could accept it. She had accepted most things that had been offered her in the last year, accepted them with the grace of a woman who knows that the alternative is a kind of complaint that serves no one. She had accepted her father's death, and the entail and the 70 pounds, and the thin curtains, and the borrowed gown, and the marriage that had been offered as mercy and received as the best available option. She was practiced at acceptance. She was, in fact, excellent at it. She thought of Thomas in the library, his hand on top of hers, watching her lips. She thought of the way he had leaned against her arm. She thought of 7 years of endurance and a white gown on a marble floor and a child she had stopped for because he needed stopping for. She thought of the look on Edmund's face when he had said simply, and with a certainty that she had not known how to interpret, that her father had been a good man. She walked to the east window. The 6 matrons cleared a small space for her with the instinctive response of people who suddenly find they are in the middle of something they did not arrange for. "Lady Dorothea," she said. Her voice was level and clear, and quite audible in the radius around the window. "I would be grateful if you did not say that again." Lady Dorothea turned to look at her with an expression that combined surprise and a kind of experienced contempt. "I beg your pardon?" "A charity case," Henrietta said. "You have said it 3 times in 3 settings this season. I have heard it twice myself, and been told of the 3rd occasion. I understand your concern for your nephew's judgment. I share it in the sense that I have wondered, since April, what he understood when he made his offer, and what I understood when I accepted it. I do not believe we understood the same thing." She paused. The room had gone very quiet. Not the held-breath quiet of a crowd waiting for blood, but the different kind, the kind that happens when something true is being said aloud in a public place, and people are not quite certain how to move. "I accepted the Duke of Ashford's offer because I had 70 pounds and no house and no position, and because endurance was what I knew how to do. I have not pretended otherwise to anyone. If that is your definition of a charity case, then I accept the description. I would only ask that you say it to my face." She stopped speaking. Her heart was very loud in her ears, and her hands were quite still. Lady Dorothea's face had gone through 3 distinct expressions in the space of 10 seconds, none of which Henrietta had ever seen on it before. The first was surprise. The second was a kind of recalibration, the expression of a woman whose chosen instrument has refused to behave as expected. The third, and the one that stayed, was something harder to name, a shade of recognition that was not quite respect, and was not quite shame, but which lived in the same neighborhood as both. Her mouth opened. She said nothing. The silence in the Harwick rooms lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then the sound came, not a murmur or a whisper, but the heavier, more ambiguous sound of 300 people exhaling at once, and Henrietta felt the weight of the room shift around her, a slow, uncertain thing, as though the geometry had not yet decided where to settle. It was then that she heard the footsteps. She did not need to turn to know whose they were. She had been living at Ashford Park for 3 weeks, and she had learned, without intending to, the particular quality of his movement across a room, the even measured pace of a man who does not hurry because he does not need to. The crowd parted for him, the way crowds part for men of his rank, not from obedience exactly, but from the body's instinctive arithmetic about where power is located. He came to stand beside her. Not behind her, and not in front of her, but beside her. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm along hers, and he turned to face the east window and the 6 matrons and Lady Dorothea, with his face as still and composed as it always was. "My wife," he said, addressing the room at the particular measured volume that requires no amplification, "has said what I should have said in April." He paused. In the silence, Miss Fontaine's fan closed with a small, precise sound. "I made her an offer, framed as mercy," Edmund continued. "That was my error, not hers. I offer her marriage because I have known for 7 years that there is no one in any room I have entered who possesses her quality of character. The settlement reflects my understanding of what she is worth. The marriage reflects my understanding of what I am fortunate to have." He looked at Lady Dorothea, not unkindly, but with the final quality of a man who has said the last necessary word on a subject. "I would be grateful, Aunt, if you would extend to the Duchess of Ashford the courtesies due her position." Lady Dorothea said nothing. What passed across her face was brief and contained and quite human, the expression of a woman who has organized her world around a particular set of certainties and has just watched one of the foundational ones step quietly out of place. She inclined her head very slightly. It was the smallest motion she could make that still constituted acknowledgement. Miss Fontaine had already turned away. She was speaking to her mother with the composed efficiency of a young woman who is deciding something, and whatever she was deciding, it was clear that it did not involve remaining in the Harwick rooms any longer than was necessary for the proper form of withdrawal. Several of the 6 matrons were looking at Henrietta with expressions that had traveled, in the course of the last 5 minutes, from careful sympathy through surprise to something that looked, cautiously, like regard. The Countess of Barrow, who had been standing at the edge of the group, met Henrietta's eyes and offered a small nod that conveyed, with the economy of a woman who has navigated social weather for 40 years, that she had heard something this evening that revised her prior accounting. Mr. Pruitt, the solicitor, was present at the edge of the room in his professional capacity, attending to a matter of the Harwick estate for a different family, and he took note of the evening's events with the practiced blankness of a man who processes a great deal of information and files it accurately. He had drawn up the Ashford settlement. He knew what the Duke had asked him to include in it. He had understood, drafting those clauses, that his employer's intention was not principally merciful. Henrietta stood in the candlelight of the Harwick rooms and felt Edmund's arm still close against hers, and she was very still. And she thought, with the slightly stunned quality of a person who has been braced for impact, and found instead that the ground had rearranged itself, that she had perhaps misunderstood a great deal. He offered her his arm to leave. She took it. They did not speak on the way to the carriage, and they did not speak immediately in it either. And the silence between them was not the usual silence, not the careful, managed silence of 2 people enduring proximity, but something else. Something with a different texture, the kind of silence that holds something rather than avoiding it. The road home to Ashford Park ran for 4 miles between summer hedges, and the moon was up and the carriage was warm, and at some point in the 2nd mile Edmund said, without looking at her, "There is something I owe you an explanation of." She waited. "In Bath," he said, "in the summer of 1807. You did not see me. There was a child at the assembly rooms." She turned to look at him in the dark of the carriage. "I remember," she said quietly. "I was there," he said, "with my wife." He paused. "Caroline. She had been unwell, and the Bath waters were recommended. She died the following year, in November." Another pause, and in that pause she heard the weight of the thing he was not yet saying. "She died in a carriage. I had sent for it in weather I was told was only uncertain, and it was worse than uncertain, and she died." He said it with the evenness of a man who has rehearsed this sentence enough times that its edges are smooth, though the thing underneath it was not smooth at all. "I have not, since then, allowed myself to want things." Henrietta understood, with a sudden and complete clarity, the shape of the last 4 years she had observed in the stones of Ashford Park, in the running garden, in the untouched piano in the south room, in the particular quality of Thomas's watchful solitude. "The child in Bath," she said. "Was with us," he said. "He was 7 years old." "You knelt down on the floor in your best dress." He turned to look at her in the dark. "I have thought of it many times." She had spent 7 years believing herself forgettable. The particular way that word had been worn into her, by the entail and the season and the charity case and the thin curtains and the offer framed as mercy, was not a thing that lifted all at once. It did not lift now, entirely, but something shifted in it, something significant, the same quality of movement she had felt in the Harwick rooms when the ground rearranged itself. "You should have said," she told him. "I did not know how," he said, with an honesty so unadorned it almost hurt. "I knew how to protect. I did not know how to ask for anything." She thought of his commands, carefully assembled across the weeks at Ashford Park. "Come inside. It is too cold for the East Garden." "Sit down. You have been standing for an hour." "Eat something. Mrs. Cray was concerned you had missed your dinner." She had read them as indifference. She had been reading them backward. When the carriage reached Ashford Park and stopped in the courtyard, he helped her down, and his hand on her arm remained a moment longer than it needed to, and she let it. The following days carried the quiet particularity of a house adjusting to a new weather. Lady Dorothea stayed for 2 more days, which she spent in a more subdued register than she had occupied since January, the register of a woman who has miscalculated and is too intelligent not to understand that she has done so. She departed on the 3rd morning with the compressed dignity of someone reorganizing themselves around a new set of facts, and her farewell to Henrietta was brief and formally correct and contained, very faintly, the residue of something that might, in different circumstances, have become respect. Miss Fontaine had returned to London with her mother the morning after the Midsummer Assembly. She had not spoken to Henrietta before departing, but she had looked at her once, briefly, as she crossed the Harwick rooms to collect her mantle, and the look had been honest rather than malicious. It was the look of a young woman who is intelligent enough to know when something has been genuinely decided, which was, Henrietta thought, a quality that would serve her well with someone more suited to her than the Duke of Ashford. The summer moved into August, and August into the first cool weeks of September, and Henrietta's days at Ashford Park began to accumulate the particular texture of a life rather than an arrangement. She directed the roses. Mrs. Cray revealed an unexpected enthusiasm for the East Garden, and they spent several mornings there together, assessing, cutting back, planning ahead for the spring. The piano in the south room was tuned, which required the services of a tuner from the village who arrived with a case of tools and spent an afternoon at the instrument with the focused intensity of a man restoring something worth restoring. Thomas, who had been cautiously hopeful since the mornings in the library, grew gradually, month by month, from cautiously hopeful into something more solid and less provisional. He and Henrietta developed a language together, not a formal system, but a practical one, a combination of shaped words and pointed fingers and drawings in the margins of the natural history book that served the purposes they needed it to serve, which were mainly to discuss birds and weather and what was for dinner, and, occasionally, the larger questions that 9-year-old boys bring to the adults they trust with them. Edmund watched this, and said nothing, and she thought she saw it doing something to his face, that she was beginning to understand. By November, the east wing had been properly repaired. By December, the house had the warmth of something inhabited with genuine intent, not performed warmth, but the actual warmth of fires that were lit because people lived here and required warmth, and food that was cooked for people who were hungry, and rooms that were used for the purposes they were furnished for. The snow came in the 2nd week of December, which was earlier than usual, and it covered the 400 acres of Ashford in the particular soft gray-white of an early winter that intends to stay. Henrietta stood at the south window in the late afternoon and watched it come down past the glass, steady and unhurried, and Thomas was beside her with his forehead nearly touching the pane, his breath making small patches of mist on the cold glass, and he said something she could see on his lips that was the word snow, which was the first word she had seen him offer unprompted to the window and the world outside it rather than as an answer to a question. She pressed her hand gently against his shoulder blade and smiled, and he looked up at her and laughed. She had not heard him laugh before. It was the slightly unpredicted sound of a child whose voice is rarely used, a sound that startled him slightly even as he made it. And the surprise in his face at his own laughter was the kind of thing that, once witnessed, is not easily put away. Edmund came to stand beside them at the window, and Thomas pointed at the snow, and Edmund looked at the snow, and then he looked at his wife's face, and what was in his expression was not the managed stillness she had spent months learning to read, but something opened and direct. The face of a man who has finally put down something he has been carrying for a long time. "Henrietta," he said quietly, because Thomas was not watching his lips, and the moment was theirs. She turned to look at him. He said, "Thank you." And she understood that he did not mean for the day, or for the roses, or for the piano, though he might have meant all of those. He meant for the library, and for the marble floor in Bath in 1807, and for the kind of presence that does not demand acknowledgement in order to be real. She had spent 7 years expecting to endure. She had accepted a marriage she believed was pity, and come to a house she believed was a transaction, and found, in the stone rooms and the running garden, and a deaf child's trusting hand, and a cold man's careful commands, something she had not permitted herself to name while she was still uncertain of it. She named it now, to herself, standing at the south window with the snow coming down past the glass, Edmund beside her and Thomas laughing beside her. The fire in the south room was visible from where they stood, its light warm against the pale winter light in the room, and the piano was there, tuned and waiting, and outside the snow was settling over the 400 acres of Ashford Park with the patient intention of something that has arrived to stay. She was home. If Henrietta's story moved you, leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you. And if you are new here, the subscribe button is just below, and there will be another story waiting.